Trouble is, not very many people do it. We've got Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and millions of people who don't get there. So now we want to consider shortcuts. Now we want to consider that in addition to philosophy, which a few people can do and a fewer still can do well, there is another approach. Abraham started this other approach. Somewhere around 4,000 years ago, Abraham was known as Abram. And he figured out a very important philosophical principle. He figured out that God can't give what God doesn't have. Now that's something that you can contemplate for hours and hours and hours. Abram did that, and he noticed something. He noticed that God gave communication. God gave us the gift of interacting with each other, of communicating back and forth, person to person. Now, since he gave it, he has got it. He must have it. So God can communicate. So Abram noticed it's very hard to think. There are not a lot of people who do think. Why not take the shortcut of asking God? Ask. Now there were a lot of people who prayed. There were umpteen prayers around 4,000 years ago. But there wasn't this conviction behind them that God would really interact with us person to person. And that's what Abram experienced. Abe asked, God responded. Now God responded in many different ways. He inspired Abram. He inspired him to think about the oneness of God, to do something about all of these polytheistic ideas that were misleading people and getting them very confused. So, as Abram became faithful to this interaction with God, he emphasized the one God. And whenever he tried to explain that to people, people would get angry at him, they would chase him out, they would try to kill him. It was kind of messy, but Abram remained faithful. And during all this time, Abram had very little to show for it. God had said to him, I will make you the father of a great nation. There will be more of your children than there are stars in the sky. More of your children than there are particles of dust in today's reading at the Mass. Well, that's a whole heck of a lot. But Abram didn't have any kids. unless you read the Old Testament very carefully, and you find out he had 4 children, but they were not with his wife, Sarah. And as part of the problem of, is it Sarah's fault, is it Abram's fault, Sarah suggested that he try to have a child with one of the handmaids of Sarah. And he did. That was his 5th kid. But none of these 5 were children of his personal interaction with God. None of these 5 were children of his faithfulness to God. None of these were children of the covenant. So he knew that he had to be faithful to Sarah to have that child. But Sarah was already past menopause. So Abram was really wondering how this was going to come about. And God spoke to Abram in a very clear way. What did God say to Abram?
We'll give you a son.
Yeah. He said, Isaac. This is the way of the covenant. This is the Judeo-Christian way for God to speak. In the flesh. God spoke to Abram in the flesh of the baby Isaac, born of a woman many years past menopause, born in a way that only God could do. What we call a miracle. That kind of thing is not going to happen to a man who's 125 years old and to a woman who is 100 years old. So this is the kind of speech that is unmistakable. Somebody can say, God has told me, right, that we should do this. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. Right? See, we're really kind of stuck with the problem that Napoleon had. Some Frenchman went to Napoleon and said, God has told me to form this new religion. The old religions of the past are all to be superseded, and God has told me to form this new religion. Right? So Napoleon said, hey, that's really interesting. And said, what are you going to do about it, Napoleon? He said, well, I'm going to shoot you. Come back in 3 days, and we'll discuss this. That's the kind of religion we're talking about. In the flesh. And if there is something that's going to supersede the religion by Christ, then we're looking for a 3-day resurrection of some dead candidate. That's the kind of stuff we're after. This is existential. Right? This is in the flesh. It's not theoretical. It's not what if. It's not maybe. It's what is. Then Abram changed his name. Because he was to be the father of many. And he had a son, more of the covenant than of his own body. But Isaac would continue to live. And in the flesh, this kind of communication is the big difference in the Jewish experience and in the experience of the Christians that grew out of that. Is there anything about that part that you'd like to develop? Yes, ma'am.
So the society as a whole was still multi-deist there at that time?
Polytheists at the time, sure. Definitely. And it stayed that way for hundreds of years. What Abraham did was within a rather small family. It was Abraham, Isaac, and Sarah, who constituted the community of God. Then it was Isaac and his wife and their kids, and it grew gradually. So there wasn't any Cecil B. DeMille production here. Right? It was a simple, gradual growth. Yes?
Could you go back over that joke about Napoleon? It seemed that you were suggesting that this guy was the first existentialist, and if anybody suggests that there's anything after Jesus, come back in 3 days, because I'm going to kill you, and then you're going to be born again, and I'll listen to you. But there's something about Jesus' message that we're not going past. Can you go back over?
Yeah, you
I got
see,
lost on that.
if somebody says that the old religion should be replaced with the new, well then the new religion should give as much evidence as the old, and should actually give some more evidence. Right? But at least you have to come up with as much reason for believing as we have for believing in Christ. So at the moment that Napoleon told this guy what was happening, this guy decided, well, my lie is not worth my life. And he said, well, forget about it, you know, it was all just and see, that's what happened, is that people can imagine things, they can have all these glorious technicolor pictures of things, but when it comes down to doing it in the flesh, not a lot of people who really want to do something. And since this guy knew that he was just inventing it, he knew it wasn't true, then he didn't go through. Yep.
Brother, wasn't King Herod a mental trip of fear with John the Baptist coming back? I was thinking that he was had come back. Is there something?
Definitely, and the way that that works is that Herod didn't want to kill John the Baptist. He was afraid of John the Baptist because Herod knew what a fake he was. He being Herod. And he knew how authentic John the Baptist was. It's always a frightening thing to a fake. But he sort of got trapped into killing Herod, so he chopped off his head. Then he was worried about Christ, because Christ was now doing more striking things in the flesh, curing the blind, curing the cripples, much more than John the Baptist ever did. So Herod proposed, gee, then John the Baptist must have risen from the dead. And this must be John who is doing these things under the alias of Jesus. But what Abraham is showing us now is the way that God speaks. God can inspire us with ideas. He can inspire us with images. But when he speaks to us, he's going to speak to us in the flesh. And this would be the way to tell whether we're dealing with God's expression or not. And down through the ages of the Jewish development, there were many good things, there were many bad things. It's quite a mixed bag. But as you look through the Hebrew Scriptures, you find that most of it is sort of an object lesson in going wrong. Most of it is how can we mess up this interaction with God. And it gets to a point where the very good things, like the one I give you in the handout from the Book of Wisdom, it says, love justice, you who judge the earth.